Thank thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for also leading in worship today. You know, as you heard Richard's prayer and as you probably heard the songs, there's almost a heaviness that comes over you. And my hope is that through today's message that you'll see Jesus really spoke about that. He spoke about the heaviness that we go through and how do we go about living like we should. And so that's really what I want to be able to focus on today. You know, first of all, I just want to say thank you because I was invited to come back next year. So I'm grateful for that, for the opportunity to come back in 2023. And you know, one of the things that I was asking MK and Derek earlier is, can I borrow a hymnal? You know, because I know. You know, for the other churches that I speak at, sometimes I end up leading in worship, and I you know, I look at how hard you folks work, you know, and I do it not I really do it because I want to be able to honor you as servants of the Lord, to be able to have some time off where you can just finally just focus on the Word and focus on the preaching and the worship and everything else. And so, you know, if there's opportunity next year, you know, I am studying your hymnal to see if there's opportunity to possibly lead and worship, to give your folks a break, the time-honored servants that are here. And as I was looking at your hymnal, you know, I so when I was, as a younger man, I was the person that actually led these hymns in our church. And I'm looking at them, and because I know them pretty well, I'm like, that word changed, you know, or that phrase changed. And now I figured it out. So if you want to be let in on the secret of your hymnal, the words that are actually in italics have been replaced over the years, okay, which actually gives a deeper, richer meaning to the hymns. So I invite you not just to look at the words on the screen, but also to look at your hymnal, the one that's sitting in the pocket of the chairs, because what you'll find is there's a richer story to many of these hymns. My hope is that I can share that with you in 2023. Well, today's message is picking up from Luke chapter 19, verses starting in verse 41 and only to verse 44. And I was looking at it the other day, and I was thinking, oh no, I messed up. I actually skipped a section, okay? Because last time, if you recall, I was here, I talked about the 10 minas, okay? And I said that was not a message, or that was not a lesson on stewardship. It was a lesson on discipleship, okay? And then I gave some aspects about discipleship. And I looked in between that passage and the passage we're going to talk about today, and I realized, uh-oh, I just skipped. Well, you know, what do I do? Derek and MK have the slides. Do I switch to the message that it should be for today, or do I just go with it? And then I realized, hey, look at it. I actually did speak on that message. Okay, and that message was back in April. Okay, so I thought, oh, I am totally messed up now in terms of my sequence. Then I realized I moved that passage because it was the passage that precedes this passage is the passage from Palm Sunday. And so I had spoke on that passage already on Palm Sunday. Now, I probably could have given that same message today, and you probably wouldn't have known that I spoke on it back in April. But we are on track, is my whole point to you. And so if you walked in and you didn't get those colorful notes that are back there, I invite you to go back and pick that up, because my hope is that you'll see the passage that we're going over today. Isn't that apparent? Most of the times, commentators will look at a passage like this and say, oh, this is just a bridge from Palm Sunday to whatever happens next. And what I'd like to be able to say is there is a lesson that's here that I think Jesus wants us to get across. And it fits our environment today. You know, next week, I think it's next week, we do vote. Okay, and so my encouragement to you is this, is that as you know, we see all the propositions and initiatives, you know, I'm not going to tell you to vote one way or the other, but we have, you know, what we live in now is far different from what we've gone through for those of us who grew up in church 20, 30, 40 years ago. In that Christians fall on both sides on a lot of these issues, on a lot of these candidates. So my hope is that as you see what is happening in our world today, no, it's not ideal. It's not ideal for the Christian anymore. It's not that clear cut as we used to have long time ago. But Jesus, I think, actually speaks to this in this very short passage. So allow me the opportunity to be able to just go over it with you. You know, the QR code that you saw earlier is basically the notes with everything filled in. So if you lose track of filling in the blanks, you know, my hope is that you can just go to the QR code and be able to see what the answers are later on. Well, it starts in Luke chapter 19, verse 41, and it says, when he came closer, being Jesus, and saw the city, so this was right after Palm Sunday, right? He saw the city, he began to cry. He said, if you had only known today what would bring you peace, by now it is hidden, so you cannot see it. The time will come when enemy armies will build a wall to surround you and close you in on every side. They will level you to the ground and kill your people. One stone will not be left on top of another, because you didn't recognize the time when God came to help you. You know, as I look at this passage, there's one phrase that jumps out at me, and it's this, is that Jesus began to cry. As he saw Jerusalem, he began to cry, not because of what happened, but what is about to happen. You know, Jerusalem actually is named Jerusalem, and it's interpreted as the city of peace. Well, for those of you that have done any kind of study of Jerusalem, you realize it's far from that. In fact, I looked up the statistics today. Jerusalem, apparently before Christ and after Christ, has been attacked 52 times. It's actually been retaken 44 times. And it's been besieged, which means that it's been surrounded and been asked to surrender 23 times. It's also been leveled to the ground twice. In fact, it is supposedly listed, if you look at Wikipedia, as the oldest city that exists right now. And you know, as I look at Jerusalem, because you know we were intending to go there next year, I started to bone up on the history behind it, and I started to realize since Jesus' time, it's actually less a Christian city than it is a Muslim city. It's so the history that's there, the things that you'll see now, aren't necessarily just about Christianity. It actually encompasses a number of different faiths and religions and governments that have taken it over the years. And my understanding, I don't know if this is still the case, but it was in something that I was watching, where they said it's actually divided up in 4 different quadrants. There's an Armenian side, there's a Hebrew Jewish side, there's a Christian sime, and there's a Muslim side. Okay, and all of them try to figure out a way to coexist. It's far from what the name of it, what its namesake is. It's far from a city of peace. In that what we see is, and it's far from being a Christian city. You know, and so you look at this passage and you start to say, what was Jesus crying about? And I think this is what he was crying about. And so if before we even get into the notes and I fill out anything, I'm just going to tell you the message right off the bat. And that is, I think Jesus was looking at Jerusalem and he was crying because he saw that the people made a wrong choice, or are about to make a wrong choice. And he knew the consequences of what that wrong choice will be. You know, as I mentioned to many of you before, this was my banner year where I actually retired. So I was in industry, and I remember being at a meeting where it was supposed to be a life skills meeting, and they called all of us in there, and there was a guy, and basically what he was doing, he was giving biblical principles, you know, in a secular industry, you know, and without using the Bible. And it was the same thing as what I give you now. We had a handout, there were fill-ins, it was all these kinds of things. And I remember my colleague next to me, who's also my friend and knows that I'm a pastor, he's like, that was really good. You know, and he doesn't go to church or anything like that. And he goes, that was really good. Is that like the kind of stuff you do on Sundays? You know, and I was like, yeah, actually it is. And I think about the state church has come to. as well as our society has come to, is that a lot of those life skills are stuff that we talk about in church. But as I look at this passage, I try to think back on when's the last time I've heard a message on choices. Now, inherent in what we do when we talk about salvation, it's a choice, right? When we talk about being obedient to Christ, it's a choice, right? But how often do we actually help people with those choices? And as I look at this passage, I think what Jesus was trying to highlight is they made a wrong choice. And there was a right choice that could have been made. And if that right choice would have been made, there could have been peace in Jerusalem. And so really that's really what my message is all about. Because as I think about choices, that's what Jesus was trying to highlight. He's saying a wrong choice was made, so there you're going to have to live through a wrong choice. Hopefully that gives you a lesson as to how you make choices in the future. Like I said, after that time, after Jesus cried, he went to Calvary, all these things happened. In 70 AD, which was 30, 40 years later, Jerusalem was taken over. It was taken over by the Romans. And so what he predicted and cried over at that time actually happened. So the Christians of that time didn't have, it wasn't victorious in any way. And so I think about then, and I think about now, and I have to say almost the same thing's kind of happening. I don't think Christianity can claim any kind of victory in this era right now that we're living in. And so I look at that and I'm saying, is there a lesson for us as to how we live our life? And I think as we observe society, we observe what Jesus said at that time, and we know what we know from what the Bible says. I think there's a lesson that we can convey to the world, at least first convey to ourselves as our church community. So let me give you some observations about this passage. One of the things that I noticed is that this passage apparently is unique to Luke. No other gospel taught, as much as there are parallel instances that we see in the four gospels, none of them actually give this instance of Jesus crying as he watches the city, okay, or highlighting that they made the wrong choice. So it's unique to the book of Luke. The next thing that we see is that, like I said, Jesus weeps over the city, okay. We only see recorded, right, one other time where Jesus has wept. Okay, and so there must be more to it than just that he weeps over the city. What was the lesson that he was trying to tell us? The other thing is why he was weeping over the city. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, he wept over the city because they rejected Jesus as king. And what ends up happening is the negative consequences that I shared with you earlier, in that the Romans took over Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem. And since that time, it's been taken, or like I said, it's been more Muslim than it has been Christian, since from then till now. But I think it highlights this lesson, is that they failed to choose wisely. And I wonder, what is the lesson for us today? How do we make wise choices? Not only as Christ followers, but as a society in whole. One of the things I observe, because I have the next generation, my children are all millennials, they're all adults right now. But I remember there was a time which was very different from when I was growing up, when I was learning to drive versus when I was teaching my children to drive. Okay, I remember when I was learning to drive, there would be driver's ed, driver's training. You went through the simulator kind of thing that was in a mobile van. And I don't know about you, but in my case, it had a on-the-column shifter, manual transmission shifter. Okay, many of you are like, what is that? But back a long time ago, the manual transmission shift was not on the floor. It was on the column. And I thought that was the coolest thing, because I remember my dad used to drive them. And it's surprising that we didn't have whiplash to this day because of the way he would drive. And I remember that it was pretty straightforward. You go, you take your license, you go, you take the test, you get your license. Okay? Mom and Dad never got involved in that kind of, in that scenario, very, very rarely. But now, when fast forward to when my children learn to drive, You know, you have to sit 50 hours with them, and I think that number has gone up since then, where an adult actually has to sit with them and help them, you know, and you know, actually be the driver training instructor for them, in addition to the driver training. And so what happens is now things have changed so much. But you know, the other observation, and then I just spoke to the next generation. So my niece's children, and what I had discovered there is now he can't even pass the written tests because it's so hard. Because what happens is you answer the question and it gets a little tricky from what I understand. And you try to answer the question and it gives you immediate feedback that you got it wrong. So you're all nervous because you just got most of them wrong, that you can't focus on the rest of the test to be able to finish it and pass. And so, you know, my niece's son, he's taken this thing like 2 or 3 times and he can't pass. You know, he's a smart guy too. And so, you know, driving, if you look at driving, it's changed over the years. But another thing in driving has changed over the years. Remember the days when we used to go to AAA and we used to get all the maps of everywhere we would plan to go. We would map out, you know, exactly how you would get there and any alternative routes that would be along the way. And as I watch my children become proficient drivers, they never looked at a map before. In fact, they barely know where north and south, east and west is. You know, and so I find it interesting that, you know, I remember I had one of them, so I won't say who it is. Okay, I had one of my children actually say, you know, and granted, we live in this area, right? It's like, oh, San Jose's north of here, right? And I was like, no, that's not the case. Why? Because nowadays, all you do is you put it in your phone, and it takes you to wherever you need to go. You have no concept of where you are in the bigger picture. You just go where it tells you to go, okay? And what I observe, and I tell you that story, because as I started ending my career and watching the next 2 generations of workers come in, one of the things they said to me at the time, David, you know, one of the trainings, because I was a trainer, okay, and so it was one of the things that is lacking in our workforce today is they don't know how to critically think. They don't know how to think for themselves. They know how to plug something in and just follow along, but they don't know how to critically think. And so towards the end, before I actually retired, I started studying all these different lessons on, you know, on approaches to teaching critical thinking. Now, for those of us old enough, we're like, you have to have a class on how to think, you know, but you do nowadays. And so allow me to be able to share with you how do we make choices? How do we think critically? So this is a distillation of everything that I've studied and tried to present to the folks before I actually left. Okay, so this isn't necessarily biblical, but allow me to be able to interject the biblical Christian approach to it. Is that, you know, nowadays when they teach people to critically think, they say, well, first of all, what is your first impression? You go with your gut. You know, in church, there was a time where we would often say, you end up making judgments about people as far as visitors, or no, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. Visitors make judgments about your church in the first 6 seconds. They can come in, they could look at it, they can hear the guy talk. They've already made a judgment of what kind of church you are. Okay, based on that. And so it's important, the lesson for us as church leaders, it's important that we make good first impression, right, in church. Well, in a way, it's the same thing, is that your first impressions is kind of going with your gut, okay, is to say, what do you feel is right as far as this choice? For the Christ follower, we get an added bonus on that, in that, you know, we can say it's not necessarily just your gut. It's the Holy Spirit that lives within you. And it's that Holy Spirit that helps to be your guide in helping you go with your gut. The next thing that we do when we make good choices is we gather data. Okay? Again, this is all taking it from my critical thinking training and just sharing with you a summary of what I've seen and how we have to teach that next next generation workforce, is that you gather data. So you know, in addition to going with your gut and as you're trying to make a choice, you go with it. It's very clear now, right? And now we have Yelp and all these different things where people give comments, where they, you know, if you were to go to Amazon and look for a book, they tell you what's a good one, what's a 5-star, why people feel that way. You know, that's all gathering data. Data is not going to go away. And for many of you who are in the workforce now, no, data is usually what drives a lot of decisions. Well, you know, they had data back in Jesus' time. And if you were thinking about the crowd that followed Jesus, as well as the Pharisees that were at that time, in a sense, they really went against the data. The data, in my Bible reading, there was we're in the book of Mark, and there was actually a passage in there where Jesus kind of like summarizes for the disciples. Well, what happened when we fed the 4,000? What happened when I fed the 5,000? So he was helping them recall the data. You know, as I was looking at this passage, I looked at it with new eyes to say he was helping them recall the data that they already had about who Jesus is. And I think about that, and it's like they went contrary to the data during that time. But that's a key component when we make good choices, when we make wise choices. You go with your gut. In our case, it's Holy Spirit. You look at the data that is out there. Then the next thing is you seek advice. Okay? Because the data doesn't necessarily mean that that is specific for your situation. And so that's why you seek advice. Whether, you know, for most of the, I think I've given this statistic before. For those of us who are over 50, they said most people that are over 50 have some type of financial planner. Okay? Because they need somebody else that they can use as a sounding board. Right? And so you seek advice. That's the same thing that we see in the context not only of our workforce, but in our life, but even during that time. Right? If you recall, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they just argued the whole time. But did they really seek each other's advice? And I think that's actually true in not just the context of critical thinking, but as Christ followers, who are the folks that we seek advice from? Who are the people that we can go to for help in our situation? You know, I remember a time being in a larger church with a lot of friends, you know, where we were able to kind of just go over, because we all grew up the same way, we were able to watch each other and learn from each other. You know, I wonder, how is that true for the next generation? The next generation not only of society, you know, people in our, but those that are specific in our community. How do they seek advice? You know, are we there to be able to offer them advice? The next thing is you consider alternatives, right? You know, as much as you think you know based on your gut, the data seems to prove the right thing, you sought advice from other people. You know, and I found myself doing that a lot, especially in retirement, is learning from other people, but then also, what are some of the alternatives that you have? But the last thing I think I have here is what Jesus was speaking at. And that is, you accept the consequences of a bad choice. Remember, the folks at that time made a bad choice and had to live through it. And so some of the songs that MK had, actually the two songs that MK had, really aren't talking about the rosiest of situations. They were talking about singing, if my way be clear, praying, if the path be drear, right? It's talking about situations which aren't ideal. And that's for most of us. We live through situations. We live through a society now that isn't ideal. And so you learn to accept the consequences of a bad choice. I think that's what Jesus was telegraphing at that time, was this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to have to live through a choice that was poor at that time. And I think our life, as we get older, isn't that what our life has been all about? It's been enjoying those good choices, but the many, 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 many bad choices that we've had, we had to figure out how to grind through and live through those bad choices that we make in our lives. And I wonder, is there a lesson that's here that also needs to, that is being shared in society, but also needs to be shared in the church as well. How do we get through living through bad choices? Not whether it's us, whether it's our leadership, whether it's our family, whatever it might be. How do we get through living through bad choices? And so I'd like to be able to share with you, how do we move forward from a bad choice? And I kept it really simple. There's so many other things that you can say about living through a bad choice. But I think what Jesus was trying to convey at that time is you're going to have a bad situation. Okay? The history of Christianity is going to have a bad situation. So how do you live through that? And I think it seems to highlight these three things that we see. And you can, my hope is that this message is incomplete. Okay? But that you would fill in the blanks for yourself as to what are some of those instances that we see in the New Testament where Jesus talks about this. The first thing, I think, more than anything else, is that we secure eternity. Okay, if we're going to live through a bad choice, I think the Christians at that time knew that they could live through the consequences the suffering that they went through, because they knew there was a bigger picture in mind. That we live, that there was, this is not all there is to life. That there was security, or that there was eternity, and that they had that eternity secure. And I say to those that are out here, if you're thinking, whether you're a Christ follower or not, is that really is the number one question, is how can you secure eternity? How can you see the bigger picture that's out there? We as Christ followers feel we have that. We have that through the hope that Jesus Christ gives us, and that He gives us a life that is beyond this life. Well, I think that's how we live through a bad choice, no matter what our situation is that we make sure that the bigger picture is taken care of, that we secure eternity. In John chapter 16, verse 33, this is the New English translation. So I try to mix it up so that if you memorize this verse in the past, you'll see it in a different light. I have told you these things so that in me you might have peace. Now that didn't mean, remember, again, they didn't have peace in Jerusalem anymore. Okay, so he's talking about peace that's internal. In the world, you have trouble and suffering, but take courage. I have conquered the world. We can be secure about our eternity because we know that Jesus Christ has conquered that. He's conquered the world. So we can live through whatever trouble or suffering that we have, securing eternity. The second thing that I observe as I look at New Testament Christians as well as Christians beyond what is accounted for in the Bible is this, is that they built community. I just recently I've been troubled by this. I have a friend who got really sick. Now I know you've been praying for a lot of people that have been really sick. And he was needing help, and it was physical labor kind of help because he needed something moved out of his house. Well, most of us nowadays are in our 60s, so we're not that capable anymore to be able to help. And I thought to myself, and I thought of last message that I shared with you about this whole concept of discipleship, that discipleship is not just those people that are in your age group, but it's reaching down to the next generation. And I thought, who do we ask for? Now for most of us who are getting close to, if we're not already seniors, who do we ask for help these days? Who can help us anymore? What are the relationships we've built that will help us? I remember a time back when I was in my 20s where, when we were talking about having to move stuff or help around the house, you can call on a whole bunch of people that were your friends that were also young and in their 20s and 30s, because first of all, I was from a larger church, but we had a lot of connections. And now in our day and age, who is that? Who's that for us? Who's that for the next generation? And so I think it's incumbent on us to continue to work towards building community not just amongst each other, so that if we ever needed help or if we ever could offer help to somebody else, that we can do that, but also for that next generation down. It goes beyond just one generation. And so how do we build, and this is really a question for many of us, how do we build that multi-generational, perhaps multicultural community that can help each other in the future, that can live through these times of trouble and suffering that are not ideal? We find a verse in Acts chapter 2, and this is probably during a time where they had it best. This was the ideal that we all long for. Not neglecting to gather together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day approaching. You know, like I said, for many of us, these aren't the most, I won't say they're dark times, but they're not the most ideal of times. How do we, during this time, follow what the Acts 2 believers did, in that we don't neglect gathering together? And my hope is, if you're out there, especially virtually, is that that there will be a time where you can come in and be a part of this community. You know, as much as we appreciate technology and how it's allowed us to be able to do things, I mean, just think, if we had a pandemic 20, 30 years ago, it would have been terrible, because we would have no way to function as a business, no way to function as a church, right? You know, and so yes, we've got some wonderful technology that allows, and I was a techie guy, okay? So we have some wonderful technology, but there's nothing that replaces face-to-face, okay? And I found it interesting that there are some studies that have been done during this time. They're saying that test scores for students are down since the pandemic. You know, and a lot of it, they're getting that same content, but there isn't that interaction face-to-face. And my hope is that's a lesson for us as the church as well, is that there's a certain level of interaction. It's not just me spouting out a message. It's that certain level of interaction that we have with each other, that we can also practice the things that we learn from God's Word. And so my hope is that we, as we see tough times, and I think this is what Jesus was trying to get across, that we continue to try to build community in a broader, richer way. The final thing that I think we need to also do is basically what Jesus was trying to set them up for, is that we need to accept consequences. Rather than trying to always fight for the ideal, at some point we need to concede that this is the world we live in. And somehow we need to accept the consequences of the world that we live in. In Job chapter 13, I've also been reading through Job as well. I'm almost at the end of the book of Job for my Bible reading. And you see, Job was an ideal guy. He had everything going for him. And then all of a sudden, God allowed Satan to be able to do what he could do to him, take away his family, take away his wealth, all that kind of stuff. And I found it interesting, and many of you already know this story, you know, but Job highlights here and says, it responds in this way. He says, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. I will surely defend my ways to his face." You know, maybe we're living through a Job time. In November, you know, which is coming up, if you didn't know this already, especially amongst management circles, they know is that usually that's the month that people get laid off. And I was like, why do they always do it in November? And the reason that they do it in November apparently is because they know Thanksgiving is coming. They know Christmas is coming. And so it's an opportunity that as people are feeling this loss and all these consequences, is that they have family that's around to support them. Okay, so apparently that's one of the factors as to why they always lay people off around this time, between October and November. It's because they know that there'll be a possibility that family might be there to be able to help them get through this time. You know, as I think about this, you know, and think about the consequences going on, many of our folks that got laid off, it wasn't necessarily a poor choice. It wasn't necessarily a poor choice in employment or anything like that. But there is a part of that, I think, is that a lot of times, you know, we fail to recognize maybe our company's not doing too well. Maybe the one skill that I have, needs to be broadened. You know how they always talk, there's always talk now about a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, okay, and how we need to always be constantly learning. And I wonder if the choices that we make in that respect actually, you know, drive many of the consequences that we see with folks getting laid off. You know, I say that only to say that, you know, there's a point in time that just as the workforce needs to accept the consequences of what's going on, so we as Christ followers also need to say, okay, at some point we accept the consequences and we make the best of the situation that we have. You know, that's how we're going to be able to survive as individuals as well as a community. And so my hope is that this gives you just a small taste. Like I said, there's many other things that we can do when we talk about bad choices. But why do we even talk about it in church? Because Jesus highlighted it here. He said they made a bad choice. Whether you read those words or not, that's essentially what he's saying. You made a bad choice, and there's going to be consequences. And the history of Christianity is going to have to live through those consequences. That's a lesson for those folks then, but it's a lesson for us today. Is that there are bad consequences that were made because of poor choices, and we continue to make poor choices in our life today. How can we make better choices? But as I showed you earlier, you know, there's some of the ways that we can do that. But more importantly, how do we live through the bad choices that we make? And you know, this was originally because I got my Sundays mixed up. I was thinking that this was the Sunday of communion. It's not. Next week is the Sunday of communion. So if we were to go into communion, as my admonition to you, if this were a communion, this probably isn't, so you can prepare ahead of time for next Sunday, is that, you know, think of all the bad choices we've made in life. And as you think about communion and what it represents the fellowship of believers, but it also represents Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, and his finished work on the cross, is that covered all the bad choices we've ever made in life. And for that, we can be thankful. As I close in a word of prayer, I have to share with you one last thing, and that is wisdom, not necessarily from the Bible, but I think it can be mirrored in the Bible. Rather, it's wisdom from Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom ride in Disneyland. Is that if you actually walk through at the end, and if you're careful to look up, you'll see this plaque. And this plaque says this: real rewards await those who choose wisely. My admonition to you today is, yeah, we made some bad. I'm sure if you were to just close your eyes and think of all the bad choices made in life, there's a lot of them. And at some point we repent of those, and we're grateful that Jesus Christ covered those. But my hope is that the way forward for each of us is that we continue to not only choose wisely for ourselves, but to be able to teach others to choose wisely as well. Let's close in a word of prayer. Lord God, we thank you for this time. And some of these life lessons, though they're taught outside of the church, they really have roots from within your word. And so God, I pray that as we, as a community of believers, try to choose wisely and try to live through the poor choices that we've made, that God, may you continue to guide us and sustain us, just like you have in the history of all those believers that had to toil through their lives within and around the city of Jerusalem. I pray, Lord, that we would not get hung up on the things that we can do right, but to accept sometimes the reality that we have in our life now. So God, I pray that you give our folks encouragement, give them blessing, give them courage in all that they do from this point out, and help them as they choose wisely, and to give themselves grace when they choose wrongly. For we ask in Jesus'